Hi, I'm Jim Schwartz, an adult services assistant with Spartanburg County Public Libraries. And as we're trying to plan our spring and summer gardens, one of the things we focus on is the weather and how much it affects everything that we're doing. Which there was a year in which the summer never really happened. And the summer of 1816 was a dark and dreary one for a group of young English travelers touring across the European continent that had been locked off for the past several years due to war between France and Britain. The normally sunny and picturesque views of the Swiss countryside had been blanketed by a dense fog, and the party had been trapped in their house in Geneva by bad weather. During an intensely powerful thunderstorm, the party, to distract themselves, began to tell ghost stories. One of these tales was told by a young girl, barely 19, and told the tale inspired by what she had seen on her travels, of a shambling walking corpse, reanimated by its creator, whose horror so transfixed the audience that the story is still told today. That young woman was Mary Shelley, and the tale was the beginning of Frankenstein, whose horror would start a new genre of writings that we now call science fiction. However, what caused the particularly horrific weather that led to the creation of this classic work? For that, we must turn our attention all the way across the world, to modern-day Indonesia and the island of Sumbawa. There sat Mount Tambora, a volcano twice the size of Krakatoa, and on April 5th, 1815, as local inhabitants were preparing for their evening meal, a monumental plume of flame burst from the top of the mountain, launching a layer of ash out that covered the surrounding area, polluting all it touched. This was not the end, though, merely a warning, and 5 days later, 3 columns of fire split open Mount Tambora in an even more violent manner. A violent whirlwind came from the ground and blew away buildings, launched people and animals into the air, and created an aftershock that triggered a 12-foot tall tsunami, which stormed inland and washed away anything that remained. The fissures of flame and ash also sent massive amounts of rock fragments, gas, and ash into the air as what is known as pyroclastic flow, spewing forth at 50 miles an hour from the volcano. This continued for a full day after the eruption, burying most of the island of Sumbawa in 2 to 3 feet of ash and leaving even a half inch of ash on Borneo, an island 800 miles away from the eruption. The ash cloud was so thick that for 3 days afterwards, colonial British officials record that they had to conduct business by candlelight in the middle of the day. On Sumbawa itself, over 100,000 people died in the weeks following the eruption, some from injuries sustained in the event, but many more from famine, as crops died from a lack of sunlight or from disease spread by water contaminated by the poisonous ash. Inhabitants of Sumbawa were forced to sell themselves or their children for even the barest scrap of food. And even now, the descendants of the few Sumbawans that survived still talk in hushed tones and with fear of Zaman Hujan Aw, or the time of the ash rain. It will not step foot on the top of the volcano for fear of triggering it again. This devastation was only the beginning of Tambora's wrath, though, as the most treacherous part of the eruption was the tons of ash and debris that had been thrown up into the air as part of its pyroclastic flow. Due to its position, Tambora's ash was caught by the trade winds, a consistent flow of air around the world just north and south of the equator, and spread all across the atmosphere. These ash clouds would have been seen in artwork across the world for a time after the eruption, with William Turner, a famous English painter, illustrating new, spectacular sunsets caused by the catching of the sun's rays by these small aerosol particles substantially more than in his earlier works. But more than just creating beautiful sunsets, this now global ash cloud, while unable to be seen by the naked eye, formed a shield around the Earth reflecting a small percentage of the sun's rays back away from the planet, cooling the planet by 1.5 degrees globally. A change as small as that can have decidedly more drastic consequences, though, with delicate ecosystems that humans have relied upon for food and safety thrown off balance, with early meteorological records showing that the period of 1810 to 1820 having merely a quarter of the number of days without clouds or rain as the decade previous. This weather was repeated across the European continent, most of the western part flooded by uncharacteristic storms and cold, drowning crops before they could be harvested and destroying towns and villages with flash floods. In the north of the continent, the people had the opposite problem, with their crops dying in the fields, parched with thirst as the rain just would not come. Churches in Danzig and Riga along the Baltic Sea held all-night prayer vigils asking for any drops of rain, while churches in Paris and Geneva prayed for the rain to halt. The average temperature for the year in most of England was a mere 38 degrees, barely above freezing, even in the height of summer. The unpredictable weather caused what would become known as Europe's last great famine. The idea of a year without summer gives us the concept of putting on a coat one afternoon or having snow in the month of July. But to the agrarian-based society that made up most of the world in the early 19th century, a lack of summer was a year without food, as crop yields for the year in Europe dropped to a mere quarter of what they had been in the years before. While in normal times, most families devoted half of their income to buying bread, during the Tamboran upheaval period, the price of grain and bread tripled, pushing even the merest subsistence out of the reach of millions of poor. In Germany, this became known as the Year of the Beggar, and in Switzerland, it gained the moniker the Year of Misery. Crops drowned in the field as the rain continued to pour down on Western Europe, with potatoes, oats, and barley, staple crops for feeding the population, being unable to grow in these conditions, forcing people to prowl the fields for half-rotten potatoes, writes one observer, and in some cases be reduced to eating dog and horse flesh to survive through the winter. These people, forced to struggle through life, were the main sight for Mary Shelley and the rest of her party as they traveled across Europe, with her husband describing the villagers of the area around Geneva who crowded around their carriage as it passed through as an extraordinary way deformed and diseased. Most of them were crooked and with enlarged throats. These descriptions would be echoed in Shelley's Frankenstein, with the creature being described as barely human, deformed, crooked, and enlarged. The sights of the starving masses must have influenced Mary Shelley's tale that stormy night, another byproduct of the shifting weather caused by Tambora's eruption, as the creature in Shelley's tale brought death and destruction to all it touched, with nothing able to stop it, a similar tale to the death and destruction as famine and disease swept across Europe. These effects were not limited to Europe, though. 2,500 miles to the north of Mount Tambora, in the Yunnan province of China, the effects were just as deadly. The southwestern province had been seen as an ideal location for the rapidly expanding Qing dynasty of the Chinese Empire, and the population of the region had grown sixfold over the last 50 years. However, Tambora's eruption changed the vital patterns of monsoons that had allowed for the sustained farming of crops that let the region grow prosperously over the last half-century. Rice production for the region fell by 60% for 3 years in a row, with other crops suffering nearly as badly, forcing peasants to eat clay in an attempt to fill their stomach. Some were forced to sell their children for enough rice to last a week, believing that their children had better lives as servants and slaves than starving to death with the rest of their family. As the famine grew more and more pervasive, opium began to replace rice as the main crop grown in the region. Opium needed less care, was able to grow faster, and was able to grow in less ideal conditions, like the ones caused by Tambora's eruption. The peasants who had traded in their rice paddies for plots of opium found that opium was more profitable to grow, allowing them to buy the rice they needed to survive, even at exorbitant prices, and that the guarantee of money was worth more than the loss of self-sufficiency to most farmers. Less than 100 years later, by the early 20th century, China was producing 90% of the world's opium drug supply, with most of that production coming from Yunnan province. Despite constant attempts from the government in the north, opium addiction remained rampant in Yunnan province even after the end of the famine caused by Tambora's eruption, and would only be reduced following the end of the Chinese Civil War and establishment of a new government in 1949. Just to the west of Yunnan, across the mountains of Myanmar, lies the Bengal Delta, the largest river delta in the world, where the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers meet to join the Indian Ocean. Closer to Tambora's eruption, the Indian subcontinent was one of the first to experience the global cooling that would impact the rest of the world. Summer heat typically caused monsoons along the southern coast of Asia, and the ecosystem that had developed there was based around that. However, the ash cloud and cooling changed the power of the monsoon, making them weaker in the summer months, so that the crops died in the fields from a lack of water, and much more heavy and violent later in the winter months, after it was too late and the people living there had become weak from dehydration. This rapidly changed ecosystem provided a fertile breeding ground for a disease that would ravage Europe for the rest of the century. Cholera, a deadly but routine disease, had been part of life in the Bengal Delta for most of human history. A waterborne disease, cholera spread through human populations in unsanitary conditions, but was a normal and accepted part of life in the region. However, when, as a result of Tambora's eruption, the monsoons did not come to flood the fields of India, the resulting drought concentrated the cholera microbes in smaller pools of water, allowing them to cross and create more varied strains. And then, when the rains did come, drenching the fields, these microbes were able to spread and breed rapidly thanks to the higher than usual amounts of nutrient-rich water that now flooded the land. One new strain that developed from this was a particularly virile one, and an epidemic of cholera that ran from 1817 to 1824 can be traced directly back to Bengal, and this killed more than 125,000 people in Java, more than were killed in the original Tamboran eruption. Cholera was also able to spread from India to Europe through the vast and complex trading networks that England and the rest of Europe had set up over the previous centuries, and by the 1830s, this strain had been linked to epidemics that killed millions around the globe. On the other side of the world, the United States in the early 19th century was optimistic, the fledgling country fresh off their victory in the War of 1812 over Great Britain, and was ready to expand westwards, towards what they saw as their destiny of stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Thomas Jefferson, now retired from politics after serving as the president from 1801 to 1809, had retired to his plantation in Monticello to manage his estate and work to promote what he saw as the United States' future, an agrarian-based republic with small farmers forming the political and moral backbone of the land. In 1816, though, that dream was threatened by the aftereffects of Tambora's eruption that had been seen around the globe. The cooler air brought unseasonal snowstorms and frost into New England and the Atlantic coast, with newspapers and farm reports in New York and Connecticut reporting crop-killing frosts in June, July, and August. However, rain did not accompany the frost, and what few crops survived the frost were soon burned with drought. The growing season for crops was reduced to half its normal length, and 1816 quickly gained the moniker of 1800 and froze to death. This weather would continue to affect the United States from 1816 until around 1820, when records begin to show a return to normalcy for the weather patterns in this region of the world. However, there was one saving grace for the new American Republic, and that was the new western frontier that had opened to them on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains in what is now the Midwestern United States, mostly in the Ohio River Valley and current-day Illinois. As settlers moved into these lands in the early 19th century, they dubbed it a New Canaan, seeing its possibility as such a fertile land. And in 1816-1820, those hopes became reality, as that region did not suffer the effects of Tambora's global cooling nearly as much as the rest of the United States. From 1814 to 1817, the number of crops exported from this region grew fourfold, and the Mississippi River carried flatboat after flatboat of goods down to New Orleans to be shipped off and sold at markets around the country and world. These foodstuff exports helped to offset the crop shortages and allowed for the United States to more easily weather the effects of the global cooling, and pushed even more settlers out west to try to take advantage of this new promised land. In 1816, Indiana alone welcomed 42,000 new settlers, showing the mass migration that was taking place within the continent. These new settlers would establish homes and push further westward, displacing local Native American populations and fueling conflicts between the two groups. The consequences of Tambora's eruption may have at first seemed to be a minor, if depressing, footnote in the annals of history. The volcanic haze that disrupted weather globally would clear out by the 1820s, allowing for society to reestablish itself in the patterns that had been thrown off by the drastic changes caused by the effects of the eruption. However, those that emerged into the sunny and plentiful years of the mid-19th century had been forever changed by the shadow that had covered the world from 1815 to 1820. The works of Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, Li Yu Yang, and countless others were all influenced by the world in which they lived, and they showed the effects of Tambora in a way that is more humanizing than the numbers and data that science shows. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, written because of and inspired by the weather effects caused by this volcanic eruption, is credited with being one of the first science fiction novels, starting a new genre that would grow to encapsulate the world's literature and entertainment. Political winds shifted, and new ideas were born from the ashes of Tambora's destruction, setting the stage for revolutions and wars that would ravage not just Europe in the century to come, but the whole world.